buildings and the vacant lots. And you see it in Philadelphia, you see it in Baltimore, you see it in Chicago, you see it in Cleveland, you see it in Detroit. And people say, why did this happen? Well, one reason was that there was a cessation of migration. The second great migration from the South ended around 1970. At the same time, there was an out-migration of industries and higher-income families from a lot of these neighborhoods in the central city, including inner-city neighborhoods, to more, quote, desirable areas, sometimes in the suburbs, in other cases in other parts of the city. The out-migration included not only whites moving out, but higher-income blacks moving out as well, because of the structural changes with industries moving out and the creation of superhighways, which made it easier to get to the suburbs and commute to the central cities and so on, left a lot of neighborhoods abandoned. So you had the out-migration of these families and industries from the central city. The out-migration of the industries meant that the pull to the north was no longer as powerful, so people weren't migrating from the south to the north anymore. Around 1970, migration from the south to the north ended, and you had the out-migration of people in these neighborhoods, but their ranks weren't being replenished with new migrants moving in. The net effect, abandoned buildings, vacant lots. And unlike other neighborhoods in the central city, there aren't other ethnic groups moving into black neighborhoods to fill the vacancies. And that's a long response to your question about structural factors.
Well, also, you mentioned that it happened here in Columbus, and certainly happened in Boston, the freeway construction that cuts the black community off from the rest of the city, right?
You're right. So you have a lot of freeways that destroyed black neighborhoods, like Chicago is a very good example, where they built a number of freeways right through the middle of the black community and upset the social organization of those neighborhoods. So those are structural factors. Some are racially motivated, some are not.
You also mentioned redlining of districts. You couldn't get federal mortgage assistance in certain neighborhoods.
Yeah, redlining was outlawed years ago, but nonetheless, redlining played a very, very important role in the segregation and isolation of blacks in ghetto neighborhoods.
So what is the effect on the people who live in a poor,
well, let me just say,
depopulated neighborhood?
You mentioned the structural forces, and say something about the cultural forces.
Yeah.
Because after all, this book integrates the two. Cultural forces, such things as shared outlooks, belief systems, values, skills, styles of presentation, linguistic patterns. These traits that emerge in settings created by discrimination and segregation. In other words, there is a response to chronic economic and racial subordination, and often the response is cultural. Sometimes you see this when you think of meaning-making and decision-making. Cultural forces also include meaning-making and decision-making. That is, how individuals in particular groups develop an understanding of how the world works, meaning-making, and then make decisions based on that understanding. Those are very important concepts, meaning-making and decision-making, that grow out of experiences in chronically, economically segregated neighborhoods.
So, Professor Wilson, you write that some of that meaning-making and some of those decisions and some of those ideas about the way the world works that you find for poor inner-city African Americans may work very well to deal with racial subordination, but they don't necessarily translate, and they could be dysfunctional when you move into Main Street society. So mainstream society. So could you give us a couple of examples how they might work well in a certain context but be dysfunctional in another?
Well, let's take a very simple example of just making eye contact. Parents in the inner city will teach their kids not to make eye contact with strangers because it could be dangerous. Living in these segregated, troubled neighborhoods where joblessness is high and crime is high, parents have to be very protective, and they're concerned about their children. So he or she, the child gets a job, say, in a store outside the ghetto, and if he or she is not making eye contact with middle-class customers get turned off. I mean, that's the most simple example. Another example would be the underground economy, people trying to survive. So they find ways to survive illegally and get involved in illegal trading within the neighborhood. They're not paying taxes on what they learn, on what they earn.
So that would be drug dealing, but what else?
Well, it includes drug dealing. It includes babysitting when you don't, declare income. It includes selling of things. It includes bartering and so on. But you're not reporting the income. You're not paying taxes on it. And if you try to do that in mainstream society, then you're violating the law.
So you may have learned a series of values that work very well in that inner city community to survive. You try to take that into mainstream society and apply some of the same standards, and you get into trouble.
Right, and a lot of these things you can't put on your resume, if you're applying for a job. Those are just some examples.
I want you to tell me about Bill Cosby, and he went about the country saying, gee, why would an employer hire some of these young black guys with their pants half down and speaking a kind of patois that nobody understands, and they can't speak standard English, he said. And is that blaming the victim? Is there some truth to it? What did he have right and what did he have wrong?
Well, someone asked me at dinner, when you're thinking about interventions, what's more important, structural interventions or cultural interventions? And I said, structural interventions are more important, like creating jobs and providing people with the training and education that they need to succeed in the economy and so on. But there are also some cultural interventions, explaining to people that if they're going to go for a job interview, they shouldn't be wearing baggy pants and shouldn't have their cap on when they're going for an interview and so on. So in that sense, Cosby is correct to say we need to educate the young people on how important it is to meet the expectations of mainstream employers. I have no problem with that. The only problem I have with Bill Cosby is that he focuses almost solely on cultural changes, cultural issues, and ignores a lot of the structural impediments that hold people back. And what I'd like to see him do is what Barack Obama does. Barack Obama talks both about structural impediments and cultural responses to these structural inequalities.
Speaking of structural inequalities, we might want to talk a bit about the Harlem Children's Zone in New York City. Jeffrey Canada is the fellow who began it. A budget of nearly $70 million right now. There's a charter school with terrific results in a very, very poor neighborhood. And not only a charter school, but the Harlem Children's Zone takes people, women prenatal counseling right up on through something called baby college and on into a middle school, and they're moving toward high school. And I know you know a great deal about it. Tell us about the terrific success.
Yeah, the Harlem Children's Zone was created by the visionary Jeff Canada, and it includes 96 blocks in central Harlem. And Canada was able to get enough support from corporate leaders that he now has a budget of about $64 million. And he's been able to include a